HR supply chain, highlighting and showcasing solutions for the most complex challenges facing the industry in 21st century by our team of subject matter experts and mentors. Broadcasting every week, all year round, we will present the most up-to-date series of podcasts and webinars.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Bicara Supply Chain. This is Nurhadi house, and with me now, Dedman. He is an expert in sales and operation planning, president at the DBM system based in Canada. Thanks for joining us, Dov, and welcome to Bicara Supply Chain.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, so today's topic is the executive role in S&OP, and we will learn how to get the involvement of the executive in S&OP and many things. But before that, can you please brief a bit about yourself and your professional background?
Sure, I can. So as you mentioned, I'm the president and principal at DBM Systems, and we're based here in Ontario, Canada. And really, as a company, what we do is we help implement and enable an effective S&OP process, primarily working with manufacturing companies. In terms of my career, I started out early in my career actually working for DBM. And at that point in time, I was focused on implementing ERP solutions, really focused on the supply chain execution. And my specific area of expertise was the linkage of the sales functions into the planning and execution side of things. But starting about in the early 2000s, my focus really changed, growing from that through projects I'd worked on with other companies into the S&OP process. And in the mid-2000s, I actually worked on developing a corporate training and rollout program for a large multinational organization. And together with Duncan MacLeod, who's the original principal of DBM, and he's actually the author of the book Sales and Operations Planning, How to Run an S&OP Process Everyone Understands, we really worked on developing and perfecting a 5-section sheet that was a way to implement and run an S&OP process. I also ran global services for Steel Wedge Software for about 4 years. They're one of the early leaders in S&OP solutions. And then in 2016, I came back to DBM and rejoined Duncan. And in 2018, I purchased the business. So I've been part of working with probably well over 50 companies implementing S&OP, helping them tune up their processes.
Interesting. All right, so this is probably one of the fundamental questions that people may have. What does an effective S&OP mean, Dov?
Yeah, so that is probably it is a great question, because I think that there's lots of, I wouldn't say misinformation, but lots of ideas about what makes effective S&OP. And so if I look at it, there's probably 4 things that I look at to define an effective S&OP process. I would say the first one is that the process has to engage the senior executive. And what I mean by that is this is really it's a management decision-making process. And it's really the only place that they can kind of see the business that gives them both kind of a strategic and operational view. It's strategic because it's about anticipating how you're going to use capital, your inventory buffers, and all those sort of things. But it's also operational because I have to actually be able to execute the plan. So it has to engage the senior executive. The second thing is it should be allowing you or giving you a view to set the flow rate for the business. So if you think about that, just means that, we can look at our demand picture and we can look at the past and predict what our demand picture looks like going forward and align supply. But really what you want to be doing in here is making the decisions around risks and assumptions to set the flow rate for the business. So it has to engage the senior executive, has to allow you to set the flow rate for the business. And the next one is that it really should be moving you from reactionary to proactive planning. And if I look at that one, every organization kind of has a frozen or inelastic kind of time period where it's really difficult to react, right? That could be defined by your supply chain. It could be defined by your fixed costs. And so you have to look out far enough that you're planning beyond that fixed horizon, because the decisions that you start to make on how you're going to use capital and even how you're going to set future supply chain levels, that's an important piece. So it has to move you from that reactive to proactive. And then the final one is really, it should be, if it's effective, it should be aligning the organization and giving clear accountability. And that really ties back to the executive again, right? Like it's the executive has to be really clear on the accountability that they're trying to drive within the balance of the organization. So what is sales accountable? What's engineering accountable for? What's operations accountable for? What's supply chain? So kind of clear ownership in each of those areas. So, if I look at it, kind of an important question to think about, if it's working well, I should have all of those aspects in there. Executive engagement, I should be able to set that flow rate. I should be looking out far enough to drive the plan, not reacting, and then aligning my organization.
Mm-hmm. And based on your experience, what are the most challenges in S&OP and how to overcome them?
Yeah, so I think probably the first thing that I would see, in going to an organization, for the first time, and whether they had an S&OP process or not, is actually presenting a story for the business. And what I mean by that is it's a story at a family level. So a place where I can actually see the flow from the sales bookings all the way through to my execution and delivery. And often what we'd see when we come into an organization is they're doing an S&OP process. Sales presents all their charts. This is what our demand forecasts look like, and we go through the whole business, and then we turn around, and then operations presents everything that they want to present. And so really, and I mentioned this in my intro for myself, so in developing this 5-section sheet, which is a family view of the business for S&OP, we actually say in there you have to actually include bookings, so that's your order inflow. You have to include shipments. You need to include your backlog, right? So that's the difference between the bookings and shipments, production and inventory. So first thing is you got to get actually presenting a full story. I'd say the second challenge is getting too far into the weeds. And I don't know if that expression translates well enough, but S&OP really should be about setting a volume level. I talked about the setting what the flow rate is, but it should be about a volume level versus getting into specific SKUs. What's the order inflow rate day by day? Because the problem when you get too far in the weeds, you'll lose the executive. It's easy to get too focused on the almost a finger pointing exercise. And so to fix that one, you really need to make sure the focus stays at a family level and you have a really tight presentation that follows sort of a standard template. And then I would say the third major one is not focusing far enough out into the future. And this problem sometimes happens if people are trying to do what they'll call S&OP on a daily or even a weekly basis or even a daily basis. Because the problem you have then is if you're doing it more often, really all you're really doing is you're reacting. It's really hard if you're redoing your plan every couple weeks for you to look much further than a couple weeks out. And so you have to have a clear understanding of what your cumulative supply chain lead time is and be looking out far enough into the future for that. Sales has to have a clear understanding of what the order sales cycle is. So you want to make sure you're not focusing in too close. Myopic would be the way I would describe that.
All right. And how do you see the involvement of executive engagement in S&OP? And what is the role of the executive in implementation?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And I would say, so for us coming in as an organization to help companies, the role of the executive and the engagement of the executive is something that we insist on. And so, in other words, we know we will not be successful, or we'll have a real challenge being successful in helping a company if we don't have the executive involved. Because, first of all, they have to be the owner of the process. They're the only person in the organization who sits over top of all of the different departments, the sales, operations, supply chain, engineering, finance. And so they are the one who has to own that process. And so in terms of RACI, if you're familiar with the kind of the concept of RACI, they're the ones that are accountable for the process, and they have to make it part of their management cycle. So that's a pretty important part, and they want, and really what we're driving for them is to hold their team accountable for their performance and also for improvement. The other part of that is they're the ones who have to make the hard decisions. There's very few businesses that I've worked with where the supply and demand are just balanced perfectly. You'll have some businesses where you have excess capability. You'll have some businesses where we don't have enough capability, and that will ebb and flow over time. And so there's hard decisions to be made. And so the executive is the person that has to make those hard decisions. And so their involvement in there is really important, in that sense. And if we're not driving to those decisions, as I said earlier in the challenges, then it's sometimes hard to get them to come to the table because it's not meaningful enough for them. Their role specifically is they should be the person, when it comes to the executive S&OP meeting, that should be their management meeting. And that's something that we really drive with them, is how do you intersect the process into what you're doing on a management level.
Interesting. This will be our last question today, Duff. What advice can you offer to get the CEO's support?
Yeah, so it's interesting that's an interesting question, partly because if I look at our business, most of it ends up being a referral business where we've got executives that have worked with or at a company, and then they've moved to another company, and they've called us up and asked us to come in and help them. And I say that partly because one of the first things I would say in terms of advice to get the executive involved is you've actually got to educate them. And that's really hard to do within your organization because who wants to tell their executive, hey, by the way, I'm going to suggest that you take some education on this. But really, what is helping them understand what the process, what's in it for them.
Right.
And the way that I like to do that, part of that is to tie the value or the outcome that they're trying to get out of the process. So whether that's we're driving to a growth number, whether we're trying to reduce inventory, whether we're trying to improve service levels. So tying that back to the S&OP planning process. So that's a big part of that. So educating them on how that linkage works is part of it, but then engaging them through the whole education process. I'm a firm believer that you've got to get everybody on the same page. So educate them. I would say involve them early. Don't think that you can kind of get started on the process and then pull them in. Involve them early so that they're driving into the process. Stay out of the weeds. And I mentioned that earlier, but often, we want to get down, especially if we're in the supply chain side of things, we want to get down into the real specifics and the details. The challenge with that is, you get a level below where the executive will maintain their I was going to say maintain their interest, but keep their attention if we get too far in the weeds. And then I'd say the final one, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but kind of that outside coaching. It's an important role, and if I look at it, we often provide a safe place for them to learn and to ask the question and to figure out how they push the organization.
At Bichara Supply Chain, we are committed to driving global perspective to embrace technological adaptation in improving process efficiencies. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share Bichara Supply Chain. And stay tuned for the latest updates. To learn more, visit our website www.bicharasupplychain.com. Thank you for listening to us. We look forward to seeing you at our next episode.